Welcome back to the Stimulating Stuff podcast. I'm your host, Rich Vogel, and today I'm answering a couple of listener questions. The first is on neuromonitoring employment contracts and perceived loss of constitutional rights. And the second is a very interesting listener question about the potential impacts of tariffs on neuromonitoring. So let's jump in. The first question, and I'm going to read from an email here. I will tell you that this came through as a 4-page email. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a part of it. It came from, I typically, by the way, I do not respond to these things when people set up anonymous addresses. It's a little, I don't know, it's a little strange to me. It seems kind of unhinged. But anyway, I'm going to read some of this. So it comes from an email address that says, I will join or die at gmail.com. The name comes through as Join or Die Constitutional Rights. And the subject line says, do you believe in democracy? So I'll read a portion of this email. Subject is, do you believe in democracy? Most IONM companies do not, it says. If anyone who enforces these contracts thinks they are an American or they are a Democrat or Republican or even Libertarian, they are wrong and they can fuck themselves. This meant cool. This is tyranny. Anti-defamation clause claims it doesn't violate the First Amendment because it might hurt the company or something, even though if you make a true statement with the purpose of seeking justice. They should look up the word because you're not trying to go on a smear campaign. You're trying to get justice, which is supposed to be a basic human right. So is the reporting of anything illegal is going on. If anything illegal is going on, or there are active threats to patient safety. Also, is that also defamation? Defamation. Sorry, there's a lot of misspellings and run-on sentences in this email. It goes on to say, you mean you are putting loss of business over the value of human life? ? Okay, Stalin. This means you cannot report illegal activity that goes against ABRET principles because this could be damaging to the company. That explains why ABRET ignored me. I didn't give a name. I just asked what one does. Crickets. So they don't care either. That is nice. So it's all just fake? ? They're charging people $750 for an exam. A lot ignore, fail to have rules they don't enforce. Don't quite know what that means. So I want to read this next paragraph too. It says, so ABRET did not care that the company is taking shortcuts, allowing barely trained techs to bill like a physician, no oversight physicians, making independent medical calls, working multiple rooms at a time, totally fine. I suppose that a company willing to use their 14th Amendment Section 1 rights to take away their employees' 1st, 7th, and ironically 14th Amendment Section 1 rights would not possibly care about patients either. Absurd. The email goes on and on. Why did I select this to respond to? I think for a couple reasons. First is that this person is clearly not differentiating between contract law and constitutional law. And there's a big difference. Now, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that your First Amendment rights apply specifically as it relates to the government, not private employers and their contracts. And, as such, it leads me to believe that this person in signing a contract or vetting a contract probably did not contact an attorney and have it vetted. Because they would have been advised of their rights and the difference between contractual law and constitutional law. The other thing that I'll say is go back to the drawing board with those comments is I guess what I would say, and think about it from that perspective. Companies do all the time create clauses that basically limit your quote unquote rights and ask you not to defame them and such. And, in signing that contract, you're agreeing to do that. Now, I've signed those things before. I've had companies sign those things before, individuals who have defamed me even after signing a contract that says that they will not. But I look at that as a pathological problem and not a systemic company problem, for that individual. And, I would say if you truly believe your rights were violated, hire an attorney. But from what I'm seeing here, I think this is all standard stuff, and I think you're just not differentiating between contract and constitutional law. I have also, just as a separate note, the reason I read the first paragraph is I have personally also submitted complaints to ABRET that had a lot of detail about individuals putting patients at risk and doing things that were outside of their scope of the CNIM, et cetera. And I've never gotten a response from ABRET. So maybe it's just something that they don't adjudicate. Maybe they don't read the emails. I don't know. In your case, it could be related to the fact that you're writing from an anonymous email address, which is very rarely going to get a response. And I will say that this is the one and only time that I probably will respond to any email that comes through from an anonymous address, because I just don't think it's healthy. I'm happy to keep you anonymous, but I'm not going to respond to these anonymous addresses, particularly because I've been the subject of hate mail in the past from them, and I've had to use pretty inventive techniques to go and find who those people are, which I have. But I'm not going to track you down, friend. But I'd say, bud, go back to the drawing board and think about the difference between constitutional law and contractual law. Okay. So that's the first question. Second question, a listener who wants to remain anonymous wrote to me and asked the question, do you think all this tariff talk will have an impact on neuromonitoring? So the short answer is no one can possibly know for sure. The long answer is possibly. Tariffs could possibly impact prices and potentially even technologists' salaries, and I'll explain. But first, let's talk about tariffs and how they've changed. So if we go back 1 year, the tariffs under Biden, or the trade strategy, I guess you could call it, is what I would call targeted and sector specific, mostly focusing on China. So, for example, there was a 20% tariff on all goods from China, and then we had tariffs separately from that on steel and aluminum. So that's targeted in that it's China, steel, aluminum, and then also sector specific with steel and aluminum, right? So we had 25% on steel and 7.5% on aluminum, and that primarily affected Japan and a few other countries that we imported steel and aluminum from. So what changed under Trump was the institution of broad tariffs. So in addition to what was already there, there was a 10% tariff on nearly every country in the world. And then there was, in addition to that, an attempt to institute additional tariffs on specific countries and products. So just using China again as our stick figure, China, so there's a 20% tariff under Biden plus a 10% that kind of global tariff, plus approximately 34% tariff on top of all of those. So tariffs on China went from 20% to 54%. And this is true for many U.S. trade partners. But the numbers differ by country and sector. And to add confusion, these tariffs, or lack thereof, seem to change on a daily basis. And no one really knows where things are going to land. And I'm trying to be perfectly objective there. There's just a lot of volatility in decision making right now. It's a lot of wait and see. So I'll stay out of politics for now, but it was important for me to say those things, I think, to lay the groundwork to address the question about how tariffs might impact neuromonitoring. So one possible answer is, I think the primary impact would be on neuromonitoring devices. And that would also include the laptops that connect to them and then the electrodes that we use. And I think you have to think about four aspects of what I would call maybe the development of a product through importation. So there's the design, the component sourcing, so the materials that might be metals that compose the metallic alloys in electrodes, the plastics that are used for heat shrinking tubing and molding of connectors, and also packaging. So component sourcing was number 2 after design. Number 3 is assembly, and number 4 is quality control. I think these are basically the 4 aspects of what I would think of like pre-importation steps, right? So source materials for electrodes like steel and aluminum, they can come from China, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and other countries. And then services like design and assembly, they can happen in countries before they're imported. So tariffs would potentially affect all of this, certainly the source material, certainly the end product. So in fact, if you think about it, even U.S. companies, that are based here in the U.S. can source these components and services from outside the United States and have to pay tariffs on these things. So an absolute fact, and this is without rebuttal, is that all tariffs are passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, right? So potentially we could expect prices to rise on products like neuromonitoring devices and laptops and electrodes, but the future is unpredictable, I think, for 2 reasons. The first is sources for materials and services are mostly proprietary, meaning that it's difficult to tell where these originate from, particularly from one company to the next. And I'm just like picking like an electrode company for an example. You may have a twisted pair of subdermal needle electrodes, but that consists of metal alloys and shrink wrap tubing and molded plastic for connectors and everything. And it might say that it comes from one of the U.S. states. That's where the company's headquarters, but you don't know where those components come from, and those are the things that may be that tariffs may affect. Second is that tariffs change frequently. We've already had tariffs on China before Trump. Tariffs were increased, then they were reduced, then they were threatened, then they were rescinded. And today there's been, as of, today's June 29th, 2025, there's been really no deals made with any other countries. We just walked away yesterday from negotiations with Canada, and I think the only deal that I've seen is specifically with the UK on Aston Martin engines. So if you drive an Aston Martin, good for you. Beyond that, nothing's really changed. So, we've already had these tariffs. They've been increased, reduced, threatened, rescinded. It's difficult to keep up with this administration, and even the markets have largely stopped their knee-jerk reactions to these announcements because they're finding that they rarely come to fruition. And the markets, the one thing that I love about the markets, and this is like stock market, just generally speaking, is that it's apolitical. It responds to what is in the best financial interest of this country and the people who have their investments in the stock market. And that's not just private investors, but that's people who have 401ks and pension plans, police, firemen, et cetera. It's all there. And the market responds to news in either a way that is suggests it's favorable for all of those people or it's not favorable. And the market had some pretty significant downswings around tariffs, but they've all basically come back to normal. I think we had 92 all-time market highs last year in 2024. I think we've had one so far this year, but it was one of the most significant recoveries in U.S. history. So, generally the market is not responding with skepticism, but we'll see what happens coming down the line. But it's important to consider that, the impact on tariffs on the market, and particularly the prices of all imported goods and services, probably we're not going to see any difference until the fall, meaning, the end of Q3 or beginning of Q4. And I think that for 2 reasons. The first is there isn't enough turnover in the supply chain in general to sell the items that were already imported before the tariffs kicked in. So those things are still out there. We're not seeing the upticks yet, but once that supply chain runs down and we start essentially buying and using the things that are post tariffs, that's when you'll see the price hikes. And we've already seen some of that at Walmart and some other goods. It's being politicized, but it's just a fact. A company is going to do what a company needs to do in order to maintain its margins. The second reason is because it's not going to be until the Q3 earnings calls from multiple corporations that we'll start to see the impact of those companies, of tariffs on those companies, and learn their supply and pricing strategies to offset this significant and widespread economic challenges that they're facing. Another way tariffs can impact neuromonitoring, and I'll call this the secondary way, right? The primary way is increases on neuromonitoring devices, electrodes, laptops, right? The secondary way is related to the purchasing power in the marketplace, meaning the availability of funds, particularly in hospitals and health systems, and the downstream impact that this could have on the workforce, and that means primarily technologists. So intimately connected to tariffs is the principle of economic cycles and economic equilibrium as they relate to supply and demand. And there's a ton of data on this concept related to the interaction between workforce availability and compensation. So I'll use the accounting profession as an example. So accountants, when the total number of accountants, meaning the supply, is low in the United States, compensation, so salaries of accountants, tends to be much higher because they can charge more, right? And because of that, you start to see an uptick in the number of people who major in accounting because they look at this and they say, oh, there's good salary over there, right? So admissions rise, and then you get more accountants in the workforce, and then we get a surplus of accountants. And as a result of the surplus, there's more people out there competing, compensation falls. So they just can't, charge as much or demand as much because there's too much competition. So because the compensation is essentially lower, then you see admission rates drop for people wanting to pursue a career in accounting. And then we get a deficit in accountants. There's not enough of them. And the cycle continues until we reach a theoretical point of economic equilibrium, meaning we have just enough accountants making the right amount of money to support the demand, essentially. And I don't want to make this an economics lesson and get into, supply and demand curves and elasticity and stuff like that. But I just want to make the point that this can also happen with technologist salaries or really anything in the market, including items in the supply chain. Now, of course, supply and demand are not the only variables that impact price. There's also, for example, willingness to pay or ability to pay even. And there's been a lot of talk about iPhones as an example. So today an iPhone can cost about $1,000. And by all accounts, if it were even possible to move the iPhone manufacturing to the US, which we know with absolute certainty it is not, but if it were, the price, by all accounts, would be over $6,000 for one iPhone. So would you be willing to or able to pay for an iPhone at $6,000 under those tariffs? So when it comes to neuromonitoring and willingness to pay, we have to consider at least three factors, I think. The first is the downward pressure from hospitals, and this is with respect to the technical fee. Hospitals basically want neuromonitoring for free, and they put out bids all the time. They don't take the best company, they take the cheapest company. It's just not valued, and they've got their own margins to worry about. Second is increased scrutiny from insurance companies, from payers. We're seeing less money come in as a result of more scrutiny from them. And then third, companies are already dealing with low margins. And by companies, I mean, 80 to 85% of all neuromonitoring in the US is outsourced to private companies. I'm talking about those technical services companies. So these things, they limit the pool of money companies are able to pay for neuromonitoring services. So if costs rise in things like electrodes and salaries, and companies can't extract any more revenue from hospitals and payers, then profits drop, which can be devastating. Particularly as profits approach zero, right? And if they go below zero, it's called a charity, right? But you need to have profits. You need to be reinvesting your money in order to advance your company. So many companies in the neuromonitoring space are operating on single digit margins, meaning that the amount of money that is essentially profit is less than 10% of the total revenue they received. So often, in fact, it's way less than 10%. And most companies like to be at an absolute minimum of a 20% profit margin. So you might say, well, we'll just charge the hospitals more, right? We'll just charge hospitals a higher technical fee to ensure that we keep our salaries. Because the thing you have to realize is that, let's say a hospital pays $500 for neuromonitoring, right, for that service. Part of that money goes to a technologist's salary. Part of it goes to maintenance of or buying new electrodes and maintenance of equipment or purchasing new equipment. Certainly, the professional fee from the insurance side is a lot more. We already know that $500 technical fee doesn't even begin to cover the cost, so it's basically supported by the professional fee. But imagine if a neuromonitoring company has to charge more money to a hospital because the cost of electrodes went up, the cost of the neuromonitoring device and laptops went up, right? And the hospital only has so much money. So they may say no. Well, the electrodes are required, the laptop is required, the neuromonitoring device is required, the technologist is required, but as much as you can try to negotiate lower rates with those companies that supply electrodes and device and laptops, et cetera, they have their own margins to worry about. So they only have so much negotiation power. So at the end of the day, which one of these things gives? What gives ultimately is the technologist's salaries. So health systems right now, they are scrambling with unpredictability and loss of funding. They've lost funding for epilepsy and cancer, et cetera. I was at an investor conference a few months ago, and there was a group of hospital CEOs, health system CEOs there. And one of the things that stood out to me is they told me that they had planning meetings of approximately quarterly to address, the next quarter forecasting, et cetera. So approximately quarterly, every 4 months. They told us, our group, that they were having meetings on a daily basis because there's so much happening right now with politics and with cuts to healthcare and spending that, they're on razor thin margins too, usually around 1 to 3%. And now they're looking at, all across the country, health systems are downsizing. We're seeing unprecedented layoffs. We're seeing rural health centers being closed or planning to close. So, now that we're on the cusp of this big, beautiful bill, and again, I'm staying out of politics. I'm just talking about the actual facts here. The big, beautiful bill changes literally every single day. So I'm not sure what to expect. But right now, we're looking about $490 billion in Medicare cuts, plus Medicaid cuts that will in total, negatively impact over 100 million Americans. And what that means ultimately in the healthcare space is that there's less money in the pool for these hospitals. So tens of thousands of people being laid off from these hospitals due to cuts, and there's no padding in the budget for hospitals, to pay their own employees, much less pay more money for services like neuromonitoring. So the bottom line is this: we're going to have to wait and see. But significant increases in tariffs can have significant impacts on neuromonitoring. If electrode and device and laptop prices rise, there will be an attempt to raise technical services fees with hospitals. The hospitals will likely balk, and the downstream impact could be additional downward pressure on technologist salaries, or downsizing of the workforce such that you make the same money, but you work even more hours with more travel, more call, and the same pay, maybe even less pay. So in the short term, certain companies' mastery of the IDR, independent dispute resolution process, may offset some of these concerns. I know that there's groups out there that are doing extremely well. There's some scuttlebutt about government investigations of abuse of this system, but there's been stories of Justice Department and OIG investigations into neuromonitoring fraud and abuse in the past, and literally nothing ever happens. So if I were a betting person, which I'm not, the number 2 reason for bankruptcy in this country today behind medical debt is now sports betting, believe it or not. And that has skyrocketed amongst young men. It's the number 1 reason for bankruptcy amongst young men, and contributes significantly to the increase in suicide. So I am not a betting person generally, but if I were a betting person, my money would be on nothing's going to change. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics. You can submit your questions and comments to the Rich Vogel subreddit or via email to stimulatingstuffpodcast@gmail.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's it today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Rich Vogel, and that was Stimulating Stuff.